Hi Jaya, hi Shrestha. Okay,
Yes, you can start.
okay, thank you. Let me wait, let me just put off the video and share the screen. So our topic for today is Unit 72, Identity, Marginality and Sexuality. Uh, Hi Shrestha. And in fact, when I was looking at the unit, it is a very difficult topic considering the fact that it has a lot of, work which has been done in terms of interdisciplinary work. So I've tried to keep this presentation simple in trying to get everybody to understand how sexuality plays a role in identity and in marginality. And I'll start with the objectives, understanding the sexual and gender identity. We have already talked about the difference between the sexual and the gender part, how that identity is different. Or we have talked about how sex and gender are different. We have also, in the earlier units, talked about identities with respect to diasporas. We have talked about a sense of belonging, and we have also looked at the fact that how the gender part has been generally overlooked while doing a lot of research on diaspora. Only now have people woken up to realize, or scholars have woken up to realize, that gender becomes a very important part in trying to understand diaspora, because the diasporic experiences are totally different for various genders. Now we are introducing in this unit the component of sexual identity. And more often than not, most of us are confused in terms of what is sexuality and sexual identity, or gender identity, because they are generally thrown in various conversations. So I'll start with, I just last week only saw this French movie. This is a French movie called The Closet. The Closet is the English translation of the movie, but it's a French movie. And if you're able to get this movie somewhere on the net with English subtitles, it's a must watch. Now, this is not about diaspora. This is about sexual identity. And as I said, sexual identity is something which most of us, or most people, not in the academic world but otherwise, cannot understand or relate to. And it's a very simple story about this protagonist who works in a company, a rubber company, and he's about to get fired. He gets to know that he's about to get fired. And when he gets to know that he's about to get fired, I'll just give the brief of the story rather than be a story spoiler. He gets to know that he is getting fired, and his neighbor, who is a gay person, tells him that they will spread a rumor that he is a gay person coming out of the closet. And that is why the name of the movie is The Closet. Now, when the people in the company get to know that he's gay, there is a whole transformation which happens in terms of the relationships with his various co-workers, with his bosses, the environmental changes. In fact, a couple of years before this particular incident, as they have shown in the movie, his wife, along with the son, leave him, and his son just ignores him. Now, once the company gets to know that he's a gay person, they start now using him as an icon for the gay pride parade in France. And when the son looks at that in the TV, he finds his dad very cool. So the whole relation with his son, with the factory workers, with a lot of other people in the factory changes. And it gives you an idea about how sexual identity and sexuality plays a role in everyday life. And that's what this unit is all about. But there is a complication in this unit because this particular movie is not about a diasporic experience. The diasporic experience complicates an already simple life because a person moves from home to host country and he is going through a culture shock. He's looking at assimilation or integration, and on top of that there is a sexual identity and a gender identity being played out. So let's start by defining sexuality. Way people experience and express themselves sexually. We sometimes forget, but we do also understand that at the end of the day, we are sexual people. Sexuality or sex is a way to propagate life. Sexuality involves biological, psychological, physical, erotic, emotional, social. There are so many feelings and behavior. The simplest is the biological and the physical aspects concerns with the human reproductive functions and the human sexual response cycle. This is the simplest. There is a much complex, interplay out here. Then let's define what is the difference between sexual identity, sexual behavior, and sexual orientation. Sexual identity and sexual behavior are closely related. Identity refers to an individual's conception of themselves. The individual's conception, and we have seen in the last units when we talked about identity and how the diasporas, identify themselves. In fact, every time the first generation diaspora typically identifies themselves with the home country, and the second generations then starts to identify with the host country. Individuals' conception of themselves, behavior referring to the actual act performed by the individual, while orientation refers to the romantic or sexual attractions towards person of the opposite sex or gender. So, in fact, that movie, The Closet, that I talked about, there is another character in the movie who's a rugby jock. He's a macho character, always picks up on the protagonist. But when he gets to know that the protagonist is gay, and he also gets to know that if he picks on this guy, he might get fired from the company, his orientation towards the protagonist changes. So much so that at one point, he comes to the protagonist and says, "My wife has left me, why don't you shift with me?" That is orientation. Romantic or sexual attraction towards person of opposite sex, same sex or gender, or both sexes or more than one gender. So if you see with the sexual identity or the sexuality, it gets further confusing. First, we have an identity, then we added the gender part to it, and now we are adding the sexuality part to it. Historically, sexual identity has been tended to view as a process undergoing only by sexual minorities, while more contemporary models view the process as far more universal and attempts to present sexual identity in the larger scope of major identity theory of processes. So, inevitably, a human identity is comprised of multiple identities, where the gender identity and sexual identities are two important parts of a human's identity. And inevitably, if all these identities come into conflict with each other, then you have to understand how difficult would that individual be in terms of negotiating with the world. And again, over a period of time, when the diaspora study started, it was very easy to look at a normative basis of male identity or a male gender. So the whole studies were based in terms of looking at the male. Then subsequently, scholars realized that, oh, there is a female gender too. And then they would had to grapple with the fact that besides the male and female, there are multiple other genders, and sexuality that they had to grapple with. So, what's the background? One needs to note that diaspora is already a marginalized community in the receiving countries. And on top of that, if they tend to exhibit a differential sexual orientation, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, collectively called LGBTQ, they are further relegated and marginalized at various levels of their diasporic existence. So that is the background. And inevitably, but the point is, if you are doing a diasporic study or a migration study, one needs to understand that multiple people who are migrating or are in the diasporic formations have their identity further divided into gender and sexual identities. And each identity has a different set of experience in the diasporic or migration frames. So while a good number of liberal democracies recognize various forms of sexual behavior as normal and have extended to its members right to pursue their individual choices, there are still countries where people are either censured or not allowed to come out openly with their sexual orientation. Because somewhere, it goes counter to the normative culture, and we will see why and how. So it was William Safran who, while conceptualizing diaspora, raised the question of gendered nature of diasporic experience. Sexuality of women becomes a critical point of discussion as they are the transmitters and reproducers of ethnic and national ideologies. That's why if you see major religions or cultures impose a lot of restrictions about on women, because they play pivotal roles in the transmission of cultural norms. So if you are able to control the sexuality of women, or the cultural component of women, then obviously the family you are able to control. The idea, the reality, and the experience of diaspora is felt differently, but people based on gender, class, age, which we have already seen in the last couple of units. So, sexuality and gender identity. Gender identity is how one feels inside and how one expresses those feelings. And the way to express them is clothing, appearance, and behavior can be a way to express your gender identity. Some people feel like masculine female or feminine male. Some people feel neither male nor female. These people may choose labels such as gender queer, gender variant, or gender fluid. In fact, these new terms have come up in the 21st century. The queer itself is a new term. Then some people's assigned sex and gender identities are pretty much the same or in line with one another. These people are called cisgender. Other people feel their assigned sex is of the other gender from their gender identity. Assigned sex is female, but the gender identity is male. These people are called transgender. Their assigned sex is different from their gender identity. A whole lot of people in the world feel that, in fact, very strongly feel that homosexuality is a disease. Okay. Just a second. A lot of people very strongly feel that homosexuality is a disease, and obviously if you terminology as a terminology you treat that as a disease, then obviously there should be medicines to cure it. We come across a lot of these people across the world. However, one of the arguments that was presented is the fact that countries which are extremely liberal to various sexualities and gender identities don't have any more number of people of those kinds than countries which normatively prohibit such numbers. So obviously, it is not a disease, and it is it's a formation. They also say that it's not even culturally constructed in terms of how people have a sexual identity or a gender identity. So they were talking in terms of biology, genes, and other things. A large number of these norms are associated with cultural practices. For example, various associated norms related to women seem disadvantageous to them and have been responsible in pushing them towards marginality. Vis-a-vis a male counterpart, for example, profession deems male. When in engineering colleges, normally mechanical engineering, civil engineering are some engineerings, or metallurgy or mining engineering are some engineerings which typically are women are discouraged from joining these engineerings because they think these professions are deemed male for no apparent reason, but they seem to be. For example, army, pilots, typically male professions, which are now changing as things go by. Scholars point to the cultural practices of parda or hijab for women to safeguard and control female sexuality and prevent them from male gaze. The cultural practices associated with menstruating women are yet another form of. So typically the society puts some sort of a sexual surveillance and it is disadvantageous towards the women. Feminist theories have seen them as a means to subvert and marginalize women in their social, economic, and political functions. So, for example, childbirth is naturally a woman's function. And, there are so many policies which a lot of companies follow where they are a little diffident in hiring women because they feel that the women will get pregnant and then will, go into childbirth, which is a very temporary feature because inevitably, and that's why some countries today and companies today recognize that the childbirth is a function, even though done by women, but a child care leave is given to the man so that the family is able to take care of the child. Now, the LGBT movement occupied the mainstream gender discussion and came into existence around the 90s. This had a direct relation to migration and diaspora, as many of these marginalized people began migrating to other countries to evade discrimination. And then we have something called queer migration, a distinct feature of migration and diaspora formation. So we have looked at in the last couple of units about trade migrants, about victim migrants. We looked at sojourners. Now there's a new category called queer migration, where people escape discrimination based on sexuality, and it's a distinct feature of migration and diasporic formation. So let's look at a little bit about the queer movement and the new sexual identity. Queer is an all-encompassing term, refers to people who are neither non-heterosexual or are questioning their gender and sexual identity. It has become an inclusive term for non-cisgender group, in addition to gay, lesbian, transgender. Term came into existence in the 19th century. Initially it was used pejoratively to refer to people who sought same-sex relation. Inevitably, various cultures and various societies have tried to enforce normative heterosexual behavior. But as we have seen historically, societies have tried to push, but sooner these people who were different from the normative heterosexual have been able to come out. Subsequently, queer activists formed an umbrella organization called Queer Nation to press upon cause and refer to a radical nature in terms of sexual desire. In the 21st century, have led to the formation of queer cultural groups, art, queer political groups to find place for them. And this becomes a pressure group then. This pressure group then lobbies to change laws and rules in various home and host countries to allow people to be comfortable with their gender and sexual identities. And the interesting part of the change in the 21st century in terms of globalization is now these queer cultural groups are able to form networks and help each other. So non-normative sexual and gender identities have been there since immemorial. Indian culture in Kama Sutra recognizes same-sex relation. Ardha Nari Shiva Varda in Indian theology aims the duality of gender identities. If you Google, you will find a whole lot of statues and figures in terms of this concept in the Indian theology. In fact, sexually, or in terms of sexuality and sexual identity, India had been exemplary example in the world. So much so that non-normative sexual people or sexual and gender people used to migrate into India because of the liberal nature of the country. In fact, it was the British who came and started imposing the Victorian normative culture and led to the implementation of the 377 criminalizing gays. Even in Western culture, we come across differential and non-heterosexual identities as early as the 16th century. In the mention of queer groups, which shows differential sexual preference, were not accepted in British society and were looked down upon. There are historical records that such people migrated to India to evade discrimination. What an interesting piece of information this is. That in fact, over history, India was always the country which welcomed just about every person across the world to come in and settle down. So India was a perfect case for diasporic and migration studies. And if you see how our society has changed into trying to enforce normative behavior. So inclusion of 377 in IPC in 1860 by British made a national offense for people who are homosexual. This was the typical Victorian, sensibility which was imposed on Indian people. It was only much later in 2018 that Indian law decriminalized homosexuality. So for hundreds of years, this this non-natural thing was imposed on the Indians. Now, the norms of sexual differences and gender identities have associated economic value, which is dynamic and has become transnational. So, for example, in the movie which I talked about at the start, The Closet, once the company realized that this person was gay, the interesting part of the storyline was this company dealt with rubbers and made condoms. And they realized the fact that firing this guy would be an advertising and a PR nightmare, because now this company would be looked as homophobic. So there was an associated economic value. The femininity, another case study, the femininity of domestic care role as a part of gender role has become a dominant discourse in economic value of diaspora in some of the receiving countries. So a lot of receiving countries looks at women only as a domestic and a caregiver. And it has an aspect. So this economic globalization or the capitalism model then milks on the gender and the sexual identities. This has also been evident in the women's labor market with rampant exclusionary racism as well as a source of cheap labor. Their sexuality remains confined to their gender roles or caregiving. What we have read in terms of the Filipino caregivers and how these women are traditionally employed in all caregiving roles. The women are assigned social and economic roles with regard to diasporic, ethnic groups or nationality and demand. So the globalization today demands that any caregiving role in, let's say, the Middle East would be given to Filipino women. That's how, that's how the supply and demand, globalization, supply and demand, plays out. And these inequalities in identities has created political and social marginalization of non-heterosexual group of people, both within and outside the diaspora relation. So think about the fact there is a person who migrates. This person, anyway, in a host country is a marginalized person. On top of that, this person, if this person is a queer person, well, you have a double whammy, both political and social marginalization. The molds of gender identity and sexuality at times also result in breaking, but there's a counter thing to it. This gender identity and sexuality at times also result in breaking the national and cultural practices and can spur political mobilization against the racialized and oppressed sexual behavior both in home and host countries. So typically, the queer groups in India today collaborate with queer groups across the world. And in fact, internet and social media today helps a lot of these mobilizations to happen. So, gender identity and sexualities are distinct attributes, unlike the diaspora, which owes its existence in relation to the concept of belonging, nationality, and homeland. So, diaspora, when we look at diaspora, we talk about belonging, nationality, and homeland, whereas gender identities and sexual identities are totally distinct attributes. Also, just like diaspora is not a homogeneous character. So if I say NRIs, non-resident Indians, it's not a homogeneous category. Similarly, no religion is a homogeneous category, or no nationality is a homogeneous category. And there are differences based on class, caste, gender, nationality, ethnicity. Gender identity too is based on individual sexual orientation. Individuals become women, gay, lesbian through the interplay of such differences. And that's where the sense of marginality comes in, because most people tends to look at very stereotypes or normative behavior. So let's look at a case study of women as heterogeneous categories. And this is the American women movement. So the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1832. Remember, in America, there was this they worked in a totally different way. For example, the American women had to fight to get, to be allowed to vote. Whereas the Indian women, right from the word independence, were an equal partner in terms of the politics of the country. This 1832 organization was established by and for free Black women. Remember, at that particular time, all women were not free. All Black women were not free. It was the first female abolitionist society. The first women's right convention held in July 1848. Indian women did not hold any rights conventions. They were right from day one an equal part. In fact, in the independence movement also, women were an equal partner with the men. In Seneca, 11 resolutions, the right to vote in 1848. And in these women conventions, the representation by Black women were just not there. So single non-white women at that time, who was named the Sojourner Truth, a former slave, symbolized the distance between ordinary and the elite. She gave a speech which says, "And I a woman," in 1851. In so much so that in 1977, almost 100 years later, when the Black lesbian feminist organization was formed in Boston, that raised the voice against the way the group was marginalized by the white middle class and heterosexual counterpart. So you see, even when the women are fighting for their own rights, there's a difference between the white woman and the Black woman. And then not the heterosexual women, if it if it's a not a heteronormative woman like a lesbian, there are further issues thrown to it. In fact, the movement was actively committing to struggle against racial, heterosexual, and class oppression. But while the movement was fighting for its right, at the same time, it was accused of marginalizing the other sexual behavior because of its dominance. So, a queer group fighting for its rights were accused of marginalizing other queer members. So this is in the course, the contents that you will get, the course material. You have this case study. Then during the World War II, when these right groups were raising their voice and challenging heteronormative practices, the bridge called My Back, writing by radical women of color, first published in 1981, pointed out how white lesbian feminism was sidetracking the experience of lesbians of color by not accommodating them in the larger fight against racism and the prevailing prejudices. So much so that even when we are looking at 2023, these fissures are open out there. So when the US reverses the right versus Roe law, and states passed law against abortions, this is actually a way to surveil women's sexuality, because the childbearing is women's. By stopping abortion or allowing them to have birth control pills, you are actually controlling a woman's body and a right to produce or not to produce. We are talking about the 21st century. During the 70s, a similar movement was launched in Britain by women of African, Caribbean, and Asian origin to espouse their causes and focus on the marginality of their sexuality. It was argued giving centrality to different sexual behavior as to who has the power to differentiate. So inevitably, in a lot of my classes, when I take classes for a lot of government officers, there is a prevalent question on typically media and culture. For example, is media distorting the Indian culture? So, for example, I would normally ask a question: A, who would define culture? Who has the power to differentiate, or who has the power to govern? How do you do that? How do you, put an authority? So, inevitably, if you're putting an authority, then somebody is trying to control. What is what is the nature of normative sexual behavior and the process through which differences are marked, constructed, and propagated? Who will do that? Because whoever is going to do that, there is going to be politics in that. So this is a very interesting question which needs to be answered whenever such questions arise. Now the gendered and diasporic subjectivity and sexual identity the gendered and sexual context of diaspora was influenced by the dominant 21st century phenomena, namely globalization and nationalism. Now there is a new thing which is coming. There is parallelly there is globalization and parallelly there is nationalism. One would have thought that with all these interconnections and internet and faster transportation and media and globalization, national boundaries or nationalism would peter out. For example, one would have assumed the fact that with the increase of science and our understanding of the world, religion would have subsided. However, we see in the 21st century, globalization is on one side and there is a growth of nationalism. While globalization has been responsible for faster spread of sexuality and developing trans-solidarity across borders, nationalism has either tried to curb such expression or made attempts to see it through a nationalistic cultural production. For example, we have been talking in the last couple of units how we can look at migration from a security lens. And more often than not, for a lot of politicians across the world, it is much easier to see through a security lens, because then the narrative is of identity politics. If we see through a different lens, then there is a different narrative. It is the male nationalistic ideology that has attempted to take control or set the discourse on sexuality and its various forms. And this is a global phenomena. And understand the fact that globalization is happening parallelly with this. So there is an article in Feminism in India. Why do women's bodies become site of war and caste and come? So when that Manipur video came out, a question was, why is it only women who are, who are paraded naked? Why are men not paraded naked? After all, if it's an ethnic conflict, then in an ethnic conflict, men should be also paraded naked if we are talking about a conflict. But inevitably, it's the women's bodies which becomes the site of war and caste and communal conflicts. Because inevitably, the normative idea is based on a male perspective. It's through the women's bodies that nations try to form communal identities and set the borders and boundaries of nationalism. It is under these lives that norms of heterosexuality as new normals have been defined by nationalism. So, nationalism, and heterosexuality. And anybody who is not conforming to this has a problem. It is not surprising that alternate sexualities have posed a serious threat to such patriarchal nationalism. And we have seen this across the world. We are seeing this across the world. It is not a local phenomena. We don't see it only out here, but across the world. It is both evident that both home and host countries of the diaspora determine and influence the female sexuality in one form or the other. There have also been instances when homeland nationalism got translated into diasporic subjectivity. We are seeing this play out in real time nowadays. So much so that, for example, non-resident Indians seem to be much more traditional Indians than the Indians living in India. So homeland nationalism, yes, Sanjeev?
Sir, I didn't understand this first para. It has also been.
So what is happening is, it is evident that both home and host countries of the diaspora determine and influence the female sexuality. So, for example, an Indian who has migrated to, let's say, the US and is a diasporic formation out there. Now, the rules of sexuality is totally different in America vis-a-vis India. Correct, Sanjeev?
Come again, sir, please.
Can you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Okay, so Sanjeev, when let's say a family of Indians, let's say in India, when a family is there, we do not, for example, are comfortable with public display of affection in the normal course of the way. Correct?
Yeah.
We don't see people kissing on the roads or,
yes.
Going hand. That's a kind of a normative behavior.
Yes.
Now, these people, when they migrate, let's say to Europe and America, out there, the normative patterns of behavior in terms of sexuality and gender are marked difference. They are much more liberal. And you can see, let's say, on American street or European streets, couples might be kissing, etc., etc.
Yes,
right?
sir. Yes, sir.
But now what is happening is that these diasporas are not only getting influenced by the local people, Indian people, but also from Indian family members, because, the cultures are traveling fast both ways.
Yes, sir.
So the sexuality, so inevitably, an Indian couple in America or Europe might express their sexuality in a different way, but now, because of diasporic influencing both from India and from their own diasporic community, they may not. They may
Yes.
say that Indian culture is about not showing public display of affection.
Yes, sir. Got it, sir.
Got it? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So there have been incidences where homeland nationalism got translated into diasporic activities. We have seen that, and that is because of globalization. Messages are and cultures are moving back and forth. How the influencing is happening is a complex phenomena. Now, gender and sexuality of women, and inevitably, because women are the transmitters, because they are the reproducers, they are also the transmitters of culture. Their gender and sexuality become an emblem of nationalistic morality. Remember the time when I don't see very much Indian movies currently. In fact, when I was growing up, that the stereotype of mandir toot gaya, when a female was defiled, those words or the classic stereotype tropes which were brought out in movies totally put the fact that women is the emblem of morality, and similarly women becomes an emblem of nationalistic morality uh, over a period of time. For example, in anti-colonial national movements, diasporic women are seen as impure. You have crossed the national border, you've crossed wo samundar saat samundar paar chale gaye, now you are impure. Whereas contrast to women in the home countries, that's how it was. The labor market has been a powerful instrument of globalization, has differentiated sexuality on the basis of gender, racial, and national identities. The labor market itself has, differentiated, and this is a, almost a way globalization is coming in. How the capitalist model is taking, gender and sexuality differently. Set the tone of globalization has forced the nation to look at diaspora solely from the angles of monetary remittance, social, political, and diplomatic capital, undermining the individual characteristics of the gender, sexuality, and marginality. Loyalty to the national identity soon became the dominant feature of identification. See, this is a very easy way to stereotype. Loyalty to the nationalist ideology, dominant features of identification in which heterosexuality has played a definite role. So, for example, there is a lot of, as I said, a lot of people have come up with the fact that homosexuality is a disease. The reason of saying that is almost like the fact that if you are not heterosexual, then you have a problem, which actually is not correct. Because each person's identity is also having a different gender identity and a sexual identity. Has played a defining role undermining the alternate sexuality. So it is not just the culture or a particular component. The transnational capitalism has an equal role to play. The desires, practices, and subjectivity of alternate sexuality with the diaspora has been unimaginable till recently. In fact, when scholars started looking at gender studies, genders and diaspora, then they also realized the fact that one has to look at the sexual identity. Because I'll tell you very interestingly, the sexual identity plays a huge part. A few years back, when the sex ratio, for example, in Haryana fell down drastically, it played havoc in the Jat heartland. The Jat heartland, because the sex ratio fell below 850. Now that essentially meant for every 1,000 boys, there were 150 to 200 less females. So essentially, this boy could not find a bride to marry. and reproduce. It played havoc in the Jat community. In fact, it has played an havoc, so much so that now in Haryana, you can Google this and find out, a lot of women from down south or from northeast are coming in and getting married to the Jat boys. Now think how it would affect the Jat culture. So much so that they are getting women illegally in terms of trafficking women to get them married to Jat boys. So sexual identity becomes a very important part of a human being, and especially in terms of as a diaspora, you're already marginalized, and then you have an alternate sexuality. It's a close relationship between heterosexuality and nationalism that has posed a challenge to the marginalized sexuality both within and outside the diaspora. So inevitably, if you are not gender normative in terms of if you are not heterosexual, there are further problems which come about. Now there is a changing dynamics of sexuality and gender. So, for example, rootless mobility has become a dominant feature of contemporary existence, making nations, home, family, etc., play in a migrant. People are moving. They are not trying to get roots, but they are moving. So, Indians moved from here to Africa. From Africa, they moved to America. They moved to Europe. Home, family play a role, and especially with globalization and this internet and media connections, now everybody plays a role in migrants' sexual life. The role could be seen to be dominating at times as it tries to control alternate sexuality and subjective desire. So more often than not, you see, say for example, a lot of cinema that gets made. For example, there was a Indian movie called Fire, which created a whole lot of storm because for the first time it talked about alternate sexuality. And then there was a whole lot of storm because does it happen? Does it not happen? A whole lot of conversation started. So this was observed by Roger Rose, who said that the cultural politics of domination always concerns the regulation of desire. We see that in households also when we try and dominate children in terms of regulation of desire. Now think about the fact a diaspora in a foreign land will be dominated by the other people from the same homeland. And now you are trying to also, because of this real-time connection with home, and the kind of interplay which happens is phenomenal. So in a book, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, Gender, Race and Morality in Colonial Asia, Laura Stoller investigates how Dutch use sexual control and gender-specific sexual sanctions to distinguish between rules from ruled and enforced colonial domination onto people of Indonesia. And if you notice, politics definitely always tries to control sexual, they put sexual sanctions. You can't marry here. For example, intercaste marriage, interreligious marriage. Who are putting those sanctions? Who is to determine how to do it? So to predict a future path for gender and sexuality seems to be difficult as its conception differ from place to place. The way alternate sexuality was viewed a century back, today, for example, the way alternate sexuality was viewed has changed. Is quite different from what social and gender movements have made it possible. So in that movie, The Closet, at one point, the boss is telling his HR subordinate, we cannot fire him because if we fire him, the queer groups will make our lives hell. It has been further argued that sexuality and gender identities are created in relation to the process and mechanism of global market forces. So it's not as simple as a nation's culture or nationalism, but there is also a global market forces which come. The articulation of identity, subjective desires, and sexuality has produced a mobile diaspora across nations, which is not necessarily dependent on gender, but also on internal dynamics. How it moves, there are multiple factors to it. Okay, so let's sum up. I think we are very much on time. Yes. Concepts of identity based on sexuality has gone through major transformation in the last 50 years, especially in liberalized economies of globalized world. What was once private and individual expression of subjective desire has become a public and collective expression of sexuality. The expression of alternate sexuality was accompanied with freedom of expression and rights movement. The emergence of LGBT community and the collective articulation by state has consolidated identity at the global landscape. That's why we have this pride parade. And people with alternate sexuality today want to articulate their alternate sexuality because they get emboldened by multiple groups across the world. An increased pace of globalization and nationalism has further created new dynamics, which has become predominant narrative vis-a-vis diasporic gendering. Identity and sexuality no remains a monolithic subject, but subjective expression. Yeah. Rehma, inevitably, have you got the modules with you? Has it already been received by you? So if you see in the modules, at the end of the modules, there are suggested readings. Besides that, I would also suggest one good way is to keep talking to each other and adding on to resources from each other, because none of us are capable of physically of capable of getting to know everything, because there are so many things at play. So once we keep talking to each other, for example, a lot of students keep giving me inputs. Shrestha has been extremely active in terms of sharing information, which I share with the groups. So once you keep sharing with each other, that's a great way of, figuring out what to read. And in fact, as I said, you can always, I'm giving you my email ID. You can always connect with me. Just a minute. So that's my email ID. You can keep writing to me. If I come across, I can keep forwarding. So whoever email ID I have, I normally share it in the class in terms of material, in terms of if I come across some interesting piece of information, I will share it by mail. I can make a mail group. I'm not on WhatsApp, so I cannot help you out there. But mail group I can, and I can keep sharing information. And the same you can do it with your other teachers. There are a number of intersectionality that has emerged in recent years, relation with feminism, capitalism. So for example, feminist studies also come and have a say in terms of sexual identities, gendering, and so on and so forth. And there are some references and suggested reading. For example, I picked up 4. There were a whole lot of them in the module. There is Gopinath, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Popular Cultures. There are, I came across a whole resource website which talked about feminism, sexuality, and queer identities. So if you search on them, and then, as I said, you can share. Okay, let me stop sharing. Any questions? I think the best way to go about, augmenting or picking or getting the right information and knowledge is to share with each other as groups. Uh, I also know, because I teach at multiple places, somehow as a culture, we are very, shy in terms of sharing. We should not. The more we are going to be sharing in terms of what we get to know, the more formations that the networks we are able to create, and the faster we are able to pick up information. Any question, guys?
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, Shrestha.
Yes, sir. Sir, though I don't have any question, but I would still like to, I think, discuss one thing which I was thinking around.
Tell me.
The history of homosexuality in India.
Hmm.
I think it's also it's it's not very clear to me if uh, if the Mughals, while the time when they were ruling, also.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, what was the, I mean, what kind of politics did they have when it comes to such practices? I mean, even before British came, we had the Mughals, and Mughals themselves must have imposed the Islamic code of conduct for their law and the marriage laws. So, was
Shrestha,
there any kind of sanction?
Shrestha, actually, the most interesting part was the Mughals uh, uh, brought in some sort of a there was no Islamic component to their culture. There was more a hybrid culture. In fact, Emperor Akbar brought in he tried to bring in a new religion, which was an amalgamation of Hinduism and Islam and certain amount of Sufism. The whole concept of Sufism itself is a hybrid thing. India, and it's not just the Mughals. Before the Mughals, there were the Turks and the Lodhis. Uh, what we are now doing in terms of this binary thing that we are talking about, India was never a binary thing. There were all these people who came in. You could categorize them as invaders, but most of them came in and then they amalgamated in the Indianness of the things. Remember, we didn't have the concept of India that time. There were all these various empires and rulers, and the first concept of India as a geographical entity, I think, started with Ashoka, but then was substantiated or thing under the Mughals. So there was never an imposition, especially in terms of sexuality. At least whatever I have read, unless there is something new, some scholarly work has done. But India had a very liberal, and if you see how the intermarry used to happen, the politics of intermarriage, the Mughals, especially Rajputs, were an ally. The intermarrying between Mughals and Rajputs, and how various people were taken sexuality, and there was, I have not come across any literature in terms of sexuality or and they were gender fluid. And as I said, India starts with Kama Sutra. We have the Chandelas and their temples in MP, which has all kinds of sexuality depicted. In fact, the whole concept of surveillance of sexuality or controlling sexuality came with British.
Yes, sir, I agree with you on that because even there is this very famous film by Satyajit Ray, which is about this Mughal or some royal personage from Awadh's king,
Awadh is
and
different. Awadh is different. Mughals are different. Awadh is different.
sorry, the different. I'm just saying that in that, I'm just trying to make the point in the context of what the hybrid culture that you're talking of, and so this film I can share with you, and
Please,
it's
please,
it's
please, please. Let me have
yes,
a look at it. So, see,
yeah.
again, the fact is, by far, most literatures do not talk about sexuality. We were very
Mhm.
fluid. The sexuality part was extremely fluid right till the British time. In fact, it was the British which came and started talking about all these morality and control of sexuality. 377 was a British a gift to us, and now we have suddenly started thinking India was more liberal with sexuality. Yeah, absolutely. Kangat is absolutely right. And the interesting part is, if you go across regions, right from Kerala to Kashmir, everybody look at the kind of diversity in terms of practices, in terms of in terms of deities, how deities are done in terms of our mythology. You should read the 300 Ramayans which are there. There is Shrestha, there is a article by Ramanujam on 300 Ramayans. If you do not know, there are 300 Ramayans, more than 300 Ramayans. So the interpretation was much different. It was actually the British who started trying to control us. And unfortunately, we tended to, because 200 years of British rule, we started thinking in terms of those lines, that there are these heterosexual normative things, which is actually not there. Human beings across, right from human history, has been very fluid that way. Shrestha?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir, for the
Okay.
insight.
India was more liberal. Yes, absolutely. Kangat is absolutely right. Long back. Any other question? Okay, we are already out of time. So have a nice weekend and enjoy yourself, and see you next time whenever we next meet.